The desert was not silent. It whispered. It carried the sound of wind dragging across the red sand, the cry of a hawk fading into endless sky, the faint echo of something once alive and now long gone. Lena Bishop stood on her porch, her black dress powdered with dust, the last trace of mourning clinging to her like a second skin. 6 months had passed since Frank's burial, yet the air still smelled of death and old sorrow. Every creak of the porch swing was a heartbeat she no longer had the strength to feel. The Arizona sun, merciless and golden, had bleached the color from her world, and even grief had grown tired of her. The land stretched endlessly before her, barren, cracked, aching for rain. She used to think the desert was cruel. Now she saw it for what it truly was, honest. It took what it wanted, gave nothing freely, and left behind only those strong enough to endure. She survived because she didn't know what else to do. Morning after morning, she woke to a house that no longer felt like a home, a bed that no longer carried warmth, a silence that pressed on her lungs until she forgot how to breathe deeply. The old well groaned each time she drew water. The hens had stopped laying. The fields whispered failure. There had once been laughter here, Frank's boots on the porch, the way he used to hum when fixing the pump, his shadow tall and solid beside hers. Now there was only emptiness, and her own reflection in the dusty window, a widow at 28, hollowed by the wind. That afternoon the sky burned copper. The horizon shimmered like a mirage, and Lena shaded her eyes with one trembling hand. That was when she saw him. A figure on horseback, emerging from the red haze of the desert like a ghost given flesh. He was too large to be real at first glance, a giant carved from the bones of the earth, his skin the color of sun-baked copper, his hair long and black, tied into 2 thick braids that caught the light like ribbons of night. The horse beneath him was strong but small, its muscles quivering under the weight of its rider. He moved without haste, every motion deliberate, as if he owned the horizon itself. Lena's pulse stuttered. Her first thought was outlaw. Her second, Apache. Her third, that she should run. But there was nowhere to go. The rifle was inside, behind the door. Her legs would not move. Fear rooted her as deeply as the dying mesquite at the edge of the yard. He stopped at the fence line, his gaze steady and unreadable. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of leather, smoke, and something wild, something that didn't belong to men at all. His eyes found hers, obsidian, calm, infinite. And when he finally spoke, his voice was like thunder breaking over dry earth. "By winter," he said slowly, his accent heavy and strange, "you'll have my son growing inside you." For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. The world shrank to the space between them, the widow and the giant. Her lips parted, but no sound came. It was not merely a threat. It was a sentence, a prophecy. She wanted to shout, to reach for the rifle, to scream that he was a savage, a monster. But her voice betrayed her. The air itself had weight. He dismounted in one smooth motion, boots sinking into the dust, the ground trembling faintly beneath him. He came closer, step by deliberate step, until she could see the faint scar running across his jaw, the way the light caught the feather tied in his hair. "My brother died here," he said, each word falling like a stone. "Your husband fired the shot. Blood for blood, a life for a life. But your death won't pay that debt. Death is too simple. It will be settled with life. He looked at her, not as a man looks at a woman, but as a storm looks at the valley it will drown. My blood will grow in you, a son, by winter. The name of God slipped from her lips, half curse, half plea, but the sky gave no answer. Only the wind sighed between them. Then he turned, called something in a language that flowed like water and flame, and a dozen more riders appeared from the far ridge, silent, watchful, their faces painted with red clay and shadow. They sat their horses like statues, eyes glinting with the reflection of the dying sun. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. Lena's knees weakened. She gripped the porch rail so tightly that splinters bit her skin. She wanted to hate him, to scream that he was a demon come to claim her life. But beneath the terror there was something else, an aching curiosity, a pull she couldn't name. When he and his men rode down toward the creek, making camp within sight of her house, she stayed frozen, listening to the sound of their horses, the muted clang of metal, the low hum of a foreign tongue. They didn't attack. They simply waited, watching, like wolves circling a wounded doe, patient and certain. Night fell, bringing a rare coolness. The stars came out, indifferent witnesses to her trembling world. From her window she could see the faint glow of their fire by the water, flickering against the dark silhouettes of the men who had come to change her life. She sat by the window, shotgun across her knees, but her eyes kept drifting back to the largest shadow, the one that sat unmoving by the flames. Nachok. She didn't know his name yet, but it lingered in the air like a word she'd once known in a dream. He sat with his head bowed, his profile illuminated by firelight. There was no cruelty in the way he moved, only certainty. He didn't eat. He didn't speak. He just stared into the flames, as though speaking to the spirits of his dead. The silence between them stretched across days. She tried to live as before, fetch water, feed the hens, patch the roof. But every movement was shadowed by the knowledge that he was there, at the edge of her world, watching, waiting. Sometimes she caught sight of him by the creek, bare-chested, washing his hands, the muscles of his back moving with quiet power. Other times he was simply sitting in the dust, carving something from a piece of wood. Always calm, always near. At night, when she tried to sleep, she could feel him, like the storm before rain, like the hum in the air before lightning. She prayed for him to leave. She prayed for courage. She prayed for the wind to carry her far away. But the desert gave no mercy. The land held her the same way his gaze did, unyielding, inevitable. And then, as the days passed, something subtle began to change. The first time she noticed smoke rising from his camp early one morning and smelled roasted meat. When she went to fetch firewood later, she found a freshly killed rabbit laid neatly beside her steps. No footprints led to or from it. Her heart raced with confusion and something dangerously close to gratitude. The next morning, the bucket by the well was filled with clean water. A quiet truce had begun without words. He wasn't attacking her. He was showing her what he could do. Feed her, fix what was broken, protect what was dying. It was the most unnerving courtship imaginable. And yet, In the stillness of the long afternoons, when the light fell gold across the valley, she found herself watching the movement of his camp, listening to their low voices, feeling the pulse of life she hadn't felt in months. Fear hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape. It had softened into something more dangerous: fascination. Sometimes she would catch herself standing at the edge of the porch, eyes searching for him, the wind lifting her hair. Sometimes she thought she saw him glance up from across the distance, as though her gaze had called him. The desert no longer seemed so empty. It became a living thing again, filled with sound, with heat, with heartbeats that weren't her own. The loneliness she had carried began to fracture, replaced by a strange, reluctant awareness of the man who had shattered her world with a single vow. He was the shadow at the edge of her light, the danger that made her feel alive again. And though she did not yet understand it, this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her healing, the first tremor of life stirring beneath the ashes of grief. If these words touched something quiet inside you, if the image of the widow and the desert whispered to your soul, take a breath with me. Let it fill you with a little warmth, a little peace. And when you're ready, remember to like, to share your thoughts in the comments, and to subscribe so you can walk with us into the next chapter of this story. Sometimes healing begins not with comfort, but with the sound of footsteps approaching from the horizon. The mornings after his arrival were no longer silent. They carried the low hum of voices from the creek, the rhythmic strike of metal against stone, the steady breathing of horses at rest. Every sound reminded Lena Bishop that she was not alone anymore. The Apache camp lived and breathed at the edge of her world, a dark pulse in the pale heart of the valley. She had once thought silence was safety. Now it was the noise that unsettled her. The faint laughter carried by the wind, the splash of water as they bathed, the murmur of a language that rose and fell like a song half-remembered. When she stepped outside her cabin, her body tensed with the instinct of prey. Every motion was careful, every glance quick. Yet as the days unfolded, that sharp edge of terror began to dull into something stranger, something more unbearable, a kind of awareness, too intimate to name. Nachok did not cross the invisible boundary between his camp and her home. He did not need to. His presence filled the distance. Sometimes she saw him training his warriors, their movements precise, deadly, almost beautiful. Other times he would sit by the fire, unmoving for hours, carved in silence like a spirit bound to the earth. He was waiting. She knew it, and she hated him for his patience almost as much as she feared his purpose. At night, she lay awake listening to the coyotes calling across the valley. The stars were vast and merciless, the same ones that had watched her bury her husband, the same ones now shining over the man who had come to claim her life. The desert had no sides, no witnesses, only endurance. And still, beneath her fear, something else stirred. A fragile, forbidden curiosity. What kind of man waited instead of taking? What kind of vengeance looked like mercy? She told herself it didn't matter. She needed to survive, to keep breathing until he lost interest, until winter passed, until God remembered her again. But God was silent, and Nachok was not gone. One morning, she found the remains of a small fire near the fence. In the ashes lay a stone carved with strange symbols, 3 lines curved like a river, a circle, and a feather. She didn't touch it. but something in its stillness made her heart tremble. It was not a threat. It felt like a mark of claim or protection. She couldn't tell which. That same afternoon, a cloud gathered to the north. She hadn't seen rain in months. When the storm came, it came fast. A furious wind whipping sand into her face, lightning crawling across the sky like silver veins. She rushed to tie down the chicken coop, to pull the laundry from the line, when the gust tore the hat from her head and sent it tumbling toward the creek. She chased it without thinking, skirts heavy with dust, heart pounding. The wind howled, drowning her breath. And then she saw him. Nachok stood on the rise near the water, rain streaking down his bare shoulders, his braids plastered against his skin. He was holding her hat in one hand, as though the storm itself had delivered it to him. For a long, trembling moment, neither of them moved. The wind pressed around them, lifting her hair, blurring the line between dust and sky. He walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate, heavy with meaning. When he reached her, he held out the hat. Their fingers brushed, and she flinched at the heat of his skin. "Storm strong," he said in his deep, accented voice. "You should be inside." She wanted to reply, to tell him to leave, to accuse him, to demand why he tormented her, but her throat closed around the words. His eyes, black as obsidian, searched hers not with lust, but with an unflinching gravity that disarmed her. For the first time, she noticed the line of exhaustion beneath his strength, the faint shadow of grief that lived behind his gaze. He handed her the hat, then turned without another word and disappeared into the rain. That night, the storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and strange. The scent of wet earth drifted through the cabin window, mingling with the faint aroma of sage. It was a smell that reminded her of the days before Frank had died, of laughter, of life. She closed her eyes, and for a fleeting heartbeat she could almost believe she was safe again. But when she opened them, she saw the flicker of a campfire by the creek. He was there, the silent guardian of her sleepless nights. Days bled into one another. The tension between them became an unspoken ritual. She worked, he watched. The distance was constant yet fragile, like glass that could shatter at any touch. Sometimes she caught him helping in ways that felt almost tender, fixing a broken fence plank, leaving a bundle of dried herbs near her porch. He never announced himself. The gifts simply appeared, quiet and inexplicable. Lena told herself it was manipulation, a way to make her dependent. Yet part of her, some hidden, bruised corner of her soul, felt something she hadn't in a long time. Noticed. One morning she found him waiting at the edge of the field. She froze, her breath caught between defiance and dread. "My brother died here," he said, voice low, heavy with the weight of memory. "His blood in your soil. I come to understand the man who took it." "You think understanding changes murder?" she whispered. "No," he said simply. "It makes ghosts quieter." The words lingered in her chest long after he left. That evening, when the sky blushed violet over the ridge, she found herself sitting on the porch, watching the smoke rise from the Apache camp. The world had grown strangely still, no wind, no sound but the crackle of her own small fire. She thought of her husband's grave, the lies she had buried with him, the ache that no prayer had soothed. And she thought of the man by the creek, his voice like rain on stone, his eyes that saw too deeply. She wanted to hate him. She needed to. Yet hatred required strength, and hers was fading. What remained was something softer, something she feared more than death itself: recognition. The next day, hunger forced her to ride to town. She hitched the old mule to the wagon, her rifle close at hand. As she passed the creek, she felt their eyes on her, the warriors silent as statues. Nachok stood among them, his gaze following her, but making no move to stop her. He let her go. The restraint unsettled her more than if he'd chased her down. The road to Dust Devil Gulch was long, a ribbon of red earth stretching across the emptiness. Every mile carried the ghost of her husband beside her, the echo of his voice, the phantom warmth of his hand on her knee. She wondered what he would think of her now, of the fear that had become her constant companion. When she reached town, it felt smaller than before. The faces of the men outside the saloon turned as she passed, their stares heavy with curiosity and something darker. The general store was half empty, the shelves dusty. Peter Finch, the shopkeeper, looked at her with pity. "Heard there's Apache camped near your land," he muttered. "Sheriff says he won't ride out that far." "I'm fine," she said, but her voice betrayed her. As she loaded her supplies, Corbin Wexler appeared. His fine clothes and slick smile gleamed against the dirt-streaked air of the town. He tipped his hat. "You shouldn't be out alone, Mrs. Bishop. Dangerous company out your way." "I can manage," she replied. "Manage?" His eyes slid over her like oil. "A widow with no protection. That land's too much for you. Sell it to me. You'd sleep easier." Her fingers tightened around the crate she was lifting. "It's not for sale." He chuckled, the sound cold and hollow. "Pride doesn't keep you warm at night." Lena forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Neither do lies, Mr. Wexler." His expression darkened. He leaned close, voice dropping. "They'll come for you, you know, those savages. And when they do, don't expect the town to ride to your rescue." She left without another word, her heart pounding. The ride home was long and heavy with dread. The sun bled across the horizon, staining the world crimson. By the time her cabin came into view, the first stars had appeared. Nothing had changed. Her home was untouched. The chickens clucked softly in their coop. The pump still worked. Relief, raw and dizzying, washed through her. The next morning she stepped outside to fetch firewood, and stopped. A freshly killed deer lay neatly by the woodpile, its hide clean, its blood drained. No tracks led to or from it. Her breath caught. It was him. Her hands trembled as she stared at the gift. It wasn't kindness. It was control, a declaration that he could provide what she could not. Yet, as she looked at the carcass, the gleam of its eyes gone, a whisper of gratitude stirred in her chest despite her shame. She dragged the deer inside, salted the meat, hung it in the cool shade. Each cut of the knife felt like a confession. She hated that she accepted his offering, hated that she was alive because of it. But she couldn't stop. The desert demanded humility, and Nachok was teaching her the language of surrender. Days grew longer. The line between them blurred like heat over sand. He was her captor and her savior, her fear and her strange, unwanted solace. At dusk, she sometimes saw him standing by the creek, watching the sunset. The light gilded his skin, caught in the feather tied in his braid, turned him into something half divine, half ghost. In those moments, the ache in her heart softened, not from love, not yet, but from the fragile healing that comes when grief begins to thaw. And when she lay in bed that night, the sound of the desert breathing around her, she thought of his words again, not as a curse, but as a shadow of something she couldn't yet understand. "By winter," the phrase echoed through her mind like the wind over the canyon, carrying both doom and destiny. She turned toward the window, the fire's glow casting warmth over her weary face. Outside, the moon hung pale and full above the silent camp. The war between fear and fate had only just begun, but beneath it, beneath the bruises of anger and loss, a seed had been planted. Something fragile, something alive, and without knowing it, she began to wait for him too. The mornings turned softer after the storm, as if the desert itself had exhaled. The air carried a faint sweetness, the scent of wet sage and new grass daring to grow between the cracks of old dust. For the first time in months, the world didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a wound beginning to close. Lena Bishop woke before dawn, as always. She moved quietly through the cabin, bare feet whispering against the wood. Outside, a thin mist hung low over the valley, ghost-like, almost holy. She pushed open the door and stood on the porch, wrapping Frank's old coat tighter around her shoulders. The rising sun painted everything gold, and she could almost pretend she was just another rancher's wife, waiting for her husband to come home from the fields. Then she saw the smoke from the creek. It curled upward in a single, disciplined column. The Apache campfire. Nachok and his men were awake before the sun. She could hear faint voices, the sound of horses being watered, the metallic rhythm of stone striking blade. It had become a part of her mornings now, this distant heartbeat that tethered her to life against her will. She made coffee and sat on the porch steps, hands wrapped around the cup for warmth. The taste was bitter but grounding. She told herself she hated that she had grown used to their presence, that she had learned the cadence of their mornings, yet she knew deep down that her days would now feel unbearably empty without it. The desert was changing her, or perhaps he was. Her supplies were nearly gone again. She needed to ride to town soon. But the thought of Wexler's smirk, of the hungry stares that followed her through Dust Devil Gulch, filled her with unease. She wasn't helpless, not any more, but she also wasn't fearless. Fear had turned into a quieter companion, the kind that whispered caution instead of panic. That afternoon, while fetching water, she saw movement near the far edge of the property, a flash of color, red cloth, sunlight glinting off metal. Nachok. He wasn't hiding, but he wasn't approaching either. He stood by the corral, watching her work. She tried to ignore him, tried to pour the water steadily into the bucket, but her hands trembled. When she turned, he was gone. The next morning, her well pump broke. The sound of snapping metal was like the cry of something dying. She dropped to her knees beside it, panic searing her chest. The pump was her lifeline. The creek was his territory. To fetch water, there meant stepping into his world. For hours she sat beside the broken handle, the sun baking her shoulders. She thought of Frank, of how he used to fix everything with easy laughter and calloused hands. She thought of the promises they made, to tame the land, to raise a family here. All of it now felt like a ghost's dream. That night she didn't sleep. The loneliness clawed at her, relentless as the desert wind. Around midnight, she heard a sound outside, metal scraping softly, rhythmically. She grabbed the shotgun and peered through the curtain. The moonlight painted everything silver and still, except for one shape. Nachok. He was kneeling beside the pump, his massive frame bent in concentration. He worked in silence, every movement purposeful. His tools glinted faintly. Nothing fancy, just a hammer, a strip of iron, a few nails. He was fixing it. Lena stood frozen by the window, breath caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to gratitude. The night air was cool against her skin, yet her heart burned with confusion. Why would he help her? Was it pity? Power? Or something deeper she dared not name? When he finished, he tested the handle. Water spilled out, clear and cold. He cupped his hands, drank once, then wiped his mouth and stood. For a long moment he stared toward her cabin, though she wasn't sure if he could see her behind the glass. Then he turned and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, she stepped outside and tried the pump. It worked, smooth, strong. She wanted to be angry, to see it as manipulation. But when the first gush of water hit her palms, something inside her cracked. For the first time since Frank's death, she wept, not in fear, not in rage, but in relief. The sound startled her, raw and unrestrained, the way the desert must sound when the rain finally returns after a season of drought. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, moving through her chores like someone learning to breathe again. That evening, she carried a bucket of water to the porch and whispered a word she hadn't spoken in months. "Thank you." The wind carried it across the valley. She didn't know if he heard, but somehow she felt he did. Days passed in a strange, quiet harmony. The Apache men hunted in the hills, their shadows weaving between the mesquite trees. Lena saw them less often, but their presence was constant, a silent circle of life that guarded her without asking permission. She began leaving small things on the porch each night: bread, dried apples, a jar of honey. They were always gone by morning. One evening, she heard a faint laugh from the creek. It wasn't mocking. It was warm, deep and fleeting, gone before she could be sure it was real. That sound, so human, so alive, lodged in her heart like a spark in dry grass. It was on the 5th day after the pump was fixed that her fragile peace shattered. She was clearing brush near the chicken coop when she heard the dry, unmistakable rattle of a snake. She froze. The sound was close, too close. A flash of scales, a whip of movement, and pain like fire tore through her calf. Her scream echoed across the valley. She fell backward into the dust, clutching her leg. Blood welled from 2 small punctures. Panic clawed at her throat. She tried to crawl, to drag herself toward the cabin, but the world blurred, colors melting into heat and fear. Then the sunlight dimmed, eclipsed by a shadow. Nachok knelt beside her, his eyes sharp and burning with urgency. His knife flashed once. She tried to push him away, weakly striking his arm. "No!" He caught her ankle in his strong grip. "Be still." His voice left no room for refusal. With swift, sure movements, he cut an X over the bite. Then he lowered his head. She gasped as his mouth touched her skin. The shock of it tore through her. Violation and salvation bound in the same breath. He drew the poison from her wound, spitting it into the dust, again and again, until the edges of her vision began to fade. When she woke, she was in her bed, the cabin dim and cool. Her leg burned under a poultice of crushed herbs. She turned her head, and there he was, sitting in the corner chair, motionless, watching over her. The firelight caught the lines of his face, harsh, beautiful, weary. He looked like something carved from the bones of the world. "You'll live," he said softly. Her throat ached. "Why did you save me?" He looked at her, the fire reflecting in his eyes like ancient stars. "A dead woman cannot bear life." His words should have chilled her. Instead, they sank into her heart like rain into thirsty soil. For the first time, she saw the humanity beneath his vow, the echo of something sacred in his harsh certainty. He stayed by her side through the night, changing the herbs, bringing her water, tending the fire. When fever dreams came, he was there, a shadow that anchored her to the world. His presence was both comfort and torment, a reminder of the line between them and how it was already blurring. By morning, the pain had eased. Her skin felt cool, her mind clearer. He was gone. Only the faint scent of smoke and pine remained. She looked out the window at the wide, unforgiving desert. It no longer felt like her enemy. It felt like a mirror, vast, scarred, but capable of rebirth. And though she could not yet admit it, part of her heart had begun to shift toward the man who saved her, not the monster who made a vow of vengeance, but the soul who pulled her back from the brink of death. That night, as the moon rose over the valley, she whispered another thank you into the wind. The sound was carried to the creek, where a single figure sat in silence, listening. The space between them had narrowed into something fragile and real, something that felt like the beginning of healing. The next dawn broke warm and pale, a thin line of gold spilling across the horizon. The land was still bruised by yesterday's terror, but the light was gentler now. She stepped outside, her bandaged legs stiff but strong. The air smelled of juniper and smoke. She felt for the first time in a long while alive, not untouched, not whole, but alive. And as the first rays of the sun reached her face, she knew the story between them was far from over. It was only beginning to unfold, slowly, inevitably, like a seed breaking open in the dark. The days after the snakebite passed like drifting clouds, slow, weightless, touched by an unfamiliar calm. The fever had left her weak but alive, and the quiet rhythm of healing filled the long sun-warmed hours. Her body still trembled when she tried to stand, her leg pulsing with a dull ache, yet there was a new steadiness inside her, a faint ember where fear had once burned. She moved through the cabin softly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over it. The air smelled of herbs, of smoke and pine resin left behind by the Apache who had tended her. His presence lingered like the echo of a heartbeat in an empty room. Sometimes she thought she still saw him in the doorway when she closed her eyes, the line of his shoulders, the deep calm of his gaze. On the third morning, she found a bundle placed outside her door, wrapped in deerskin, tied with a strip of red cloth. Inside were herbs, a small pouch of ground bark, and a strip of soft leather for binding wounds. Beneath it, a single eagle feather. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it. It was both gift and message, a mark of protection. She sat on the porch for a long time, the feather resting in her lap. The desert wind brushed against her skin, and for once it felt gentle, healing. She wasn't sure what the gesture meant, if it was apology, gratitude, or claim, but she knew it had changed something inside her. When he appeared again, she didn't run. It was late afternoon, the sun hung low, heavy and red above the horizon. The air shimmered with heat, and the shadows of the mesquite trees stretched long and soft across the dust. He came from the creek, moving with the same quiet certainty that always unbalanced her, like the earth itself had given him permission to walk where others would not dare. He stopped a few paces away, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was vast, but not cruel. It carried something fragile, something like forgiveness. "You are well," he said at last, his voice low, steady as a drumbeat. She nodded. "Because of you." His eyes held hers. "Because the spirits wished it." She wanted to tell him that it wasn't the spirits, that it had been his hands, his strength, his care that had pulled her from the darkness, but the words wouldn't come. Some truths were too raw to speak aloud. He looked past her, toward the broken horizon. "This land remembers blood," he said quietly. "It remembers what your husband did here, what my brother lost." Her chest tightened. She had tried not to think of Frank, of the things Natchok had said in her fever haze. The idea that Frank could have done harm, that the man she'd mourned could have been part of the pain, still felt like a wound she hadn't dared to touch. "My husband was a good man," she said softly, her voice trembling more than she wanted. Natchok's gaze returned to her, steady, solemn. "Good men can be blind, blinded by hunger, by pride, by the lies of others." Something in his tone, neither anger nor pity, but truth, made her heart tremble. She turned away, unable to meet his eyes. "You think you know him." "I know death," he said simply. "I know what it leaves behind." He turned then, walking toward the creek. The conversation hung between them like smoke, refusing to dissipate. That night she dreamed of Frank, his hands stained red, his voice whispering words she couldn't understand. When she woke, her pillow was wet with tears. The next morning she saw riders approaching from the east, and the sight filled her with dread. 3 men, one of them unmistakable. Corbin Wexler. Even from a distance, his polished boots and slick hat gleamed like the false smile he always wore. Her pulse quickened. She stepped off the porch, heart pounding, as the men rode closer. "Mrs. Bishop," Wexler called, reining in his horse. "I see you're still alive out here. Heard rumors say you've got company." His words dripped with poison. "I've got no company," she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Strange, then, that I see smoke down by your creek. Looks like Apache campfire smoke to me." "You should leave," she said, "before the sun sets." He smiled, slow and deliberate. "You think they'll protect you, those savages? The army'll be here soon, and when they come, they'll burn this valley clean. You'd be wise to sell your land while you still can." "This land isn't for sale," she said through clenched teeth. Wexler's smile faltered. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You know your husband worked for me, don't you? He knew the value of this creek. Gold in the hills, water in the desert. It's worth more than any vow." Her breath hitched. "What are you saying?" He smirked. "Ask your Apache friend. He knows how your husband died." Her knees weakened, but she stood her ground. "Get off my land!" Wexler's laughter echoed through the dry air. "You'll change your mind, widow. Everyone does." He turned his horse and rode away, his men following in a cloud of dust. She stood there long after they were gone, her heart pounding, her mind spinning. The pieces were beginning to fit together in ways she didn't want them to. That night, Nachok came to her porch again. The fire from his camp burned behind him, painting the edges of his face in orange light. "Wexler came," she said, her voice brittle. "He said Frank worked for him." Nachok nodded slowly. "Your husband rode with men who raided a Chiricahua camp. My brother died in that raid." Her throat closed. "No." He didn't move. "He carried a rifle like the one that hangs above your door. The shot that killed my brother came from that rifle." The world tilted. Her hands found the railing, fingers digging into the wood. "You're lying." "I do not lie," he said simply. Silence fell. A heavy, suffocating silence that wrapped around them like smoke. The truth hung there, merciless and undeniable. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "He told me he'd been thrown from his horse that night. He came home with gold coins. Said he won them in town." Nachok's eyes softened, not with triumph, but with something that looked like sorrow. He was not evil. He was lost. The white man Wexler used him. My brother's blood is on many hands. Tears filled her eyes, burning hot. She sank onto the steps, the weight of truth pressing down until she thought she might break. "I hated you," she said quietly. "All this time I hated you for killing him." "I did not kill him," Nachok said. "His wound killed him. His choices killed him. I only watched the end." Her shoulders shook. She pressed her hands to her face, the sobs tearing through her like a storm breaking open. Nachok stood motionless, letting her cry. When she finally looked up, her eyes swollen, her chest hollowed out, he was still there, solid, unmoving, like the mountains beyond the valley. "What do you want from me now?" she whispered. He took a slow step forward. "Peace," he said, "for my brother, for you, for this land." Her gaze dropped to the ground. "Peace doesn't come easy." "It never does," he said, "but it comes." The night stretched long and quiet. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, a low, mournful sound that melted into the stillness. Lena sat there until the stars thickened above her, until her tears dried, until she could breathe again. When she finally looked toward the creek, the fire still burned. She could see his silhouette against it, head bowed, a figure carved from the ancient ache of the world. And for the first time, she didn't see her enemy. She saw a man who had lost as much as she had. In that recognition, something deep and broken inside her began to heal. Over the following days, their fragile peace grew roots. He still kept his camp by the creek, but sometimes she saw him nearer now, mending her fence, fixing a door hinge, leaving food at her steps. She didn't thank him aloud, but she didn't chase him away either. Once, at twilight, she caught him standing by the corral, watching the horses graze. Their eyes met, and for the briefest moment, neither of them looked away. No words passed between them, but something wordless did, a thread that hummed quietly between two wounded souls. The desert, for all its harshness, began to feel different, softer. The wind no longer cut. It caressed. The creek sounded like a lullaby. Even the sky seemed to watch them with gentler light. She started to sleep without fear, to wake without dread. Healing, she realized, was not the absence of pain. It was the slow return of hope. And though she didn't yet dare to name it, hope was exactly what had begun to grow between her and the man by the water, something fragile, unexpected, but alive. As summer deepened, the world around them held its breath, waiting for the next turning of fate. And deep inside her heart, Lena felt it too, the quiet stirring of a new beginning rising like dawn over the ruins of everything she had been. The sun rose slower that week, as if reluctant to burn away the gentleness that had begun to settle between them. The air carried a strange calm, a quietness that felt sacred, like the valley itself was watching, holding its breath for what would come next. Lena could feel it in her bones, the shift, the surrender, the quiet ache that came when hatred lost its grip and made space for something softer. She had begun to heal, though she did not yet call it that. Her days had rhythm again. She swept the porch each morning, fed the hens, tended the patch of corn that had somehow survived the drought. And though her hands still trembled sometimes, they no longer shook with fear. There was strength returning to her, slow and shy, like spring water seeping through cracks in dry stone. Nachok and his men were still camped by the creek, but their presence no longer felt like a cage. Sometimes she saw them helping themselves to game in the hills or mending tack in the sun. There was laughter in their camp now, the kind that belonged to men who had survived too many ghosts and finally learned to breathe again. Once, she saw Nachok teaching a boy, barely more than 16, how to repair a bowstring. The boy's fingers fumbled, and Nachok's laughter rolled out, deep and warm. It startled her, that sound. It wasn't the laughter of a savage or a conqueror. It was the sound of a man who had forgotten how to laugh and had just remembered what it felt like. That night she couldn't sleep. The echo of that laughter lingered in her heart, mingling with the sound of the wind brushing against the walls of her cabin. It made her ache in a way that wasn't quite sorrow and wasn't quite joy, just the quiet ache of remembering that life could still be tender. The next morning she found him waiting near her fence. He stood with the stillness of a mountain, his shadow long against the rising sun. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, though the wind caught the loose strands of his hair and made him look almost human in his solitude. "I want to speak," he said. Lena hesitated, her hand resting on the rail. "Then speak." He nodded toward the cabin. "Not here." "Walk with me." Something in his voice, gentle but firm, made refusal impossible. She followed him past the corral, across the brittle grass, to the narrow path that led down to the creek. The air grew cooler there, heavy with the scent of water and pine. The sound of the stream was soft and constant, like a heartbeat. They stopped where the sunlight scattered through the trees. Nachok knelt and touched the ground. "Here," he said. "This is where my brother fell." Her throat tightened. She had expected anger, accusation, but his tone was neither. It was reverent, almost sorrowful. He looked up at her, his eyes dark and steady. "You need to know the truth, not the stories you were told." She nodded slowly, though her stomach turned. "There was a raid," he said, "but it was not my people who began it. It was Wexler's men, white men. They wore Apache colors to draw blame on us. They stole horses from the Chiricahua and killed those who could not run. We followed them. We wanted justice, not blood, but your husband was with them. He fired the shot that killed my brother Tsar. He hit him from far, a clean shot, a warrior's shot. I saw his face. I saw regret before he fled. The words landed heavy, each one sinking deeper than the last. She shook her head, tears burning her eyes. No, Frank couldn't. He was trying to make peace. Nachok's voice softened, almost kind. He was trying to survive. Wexler promised him gold, water, safety. He chose a path of desperation. Many men do. It does not make him a monster. It only makes him human. Lena pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her. Images of Frank flickered behind her eyes, his laughter, his hands, his sudden silences, the night he came home covered in dust and lies. All at once, the puzzle of her grief rearranged itself, and the truth was unbearable. "He lied to me," she whispered. Nachok nodded. He lied to himself. The sound of the creek filled the silence between them. For a long time, neither spoke. The wind moved through the reeds, carrying away the last fragile thread of denial. When she finally looked at him again, she saw not the man who had cursed her, not the warrior who had vowed to claim her body, but the one who had seen too much loss and still stood before her with quiet strength. "My brother had a wife," he said, after a long while. "She carried his child when he died. She tried to reach our winter camp, but soldiers came before she could. They killed her, killed our people, burned the ground. I buried them myself." Her breath caught. "I'm sorry," she murmured, the words weak but sincere. He turned his gaze toward the water. "Sorrow is the same in all languages," he said softly. "It does not care what color the skin wears." Something inside her broke open. She had spent so long feeding her pain, building walls out of rage, that she had forgotten what shared grief felt like. And here, by the creek that had once divided their worlds, she felt that wall begin to crumble. She reached out, hesitant, her fingers brushing the air between them. "Then what is it you want now, Nachok? If not vengeance?" He met her eyes. "Balance. For the dead. For the living." "By forcing me to bear your child?" He shook his head, slowly, solemnly. "By creating life where death has lived too long. By making peace with what was broken." His words struck her with the force of quiet truth. He wasn't speaking of possession anymore. He was speaking of redemption. That night, she sat by the fire outside her cabin, the sky above her vast and alive with stars. The air shimmered faintly with the scent of sage and smoke. In the distance, she could see the glow of the Apache campfire, and it comforted her more than she wanted to admit. She thought of Frank's lies, of Wexler's greed, of Nachok's sorrow, and of her own loneliness that had turned her heart to stone. For the first time, she didn't pray for escape, she prayed for understanding, for healing. The next morning she awoke to laughter again. She stepped outside and saw 2 Apache men working to patch the roof of her barn. They greeted her with nods, their faces open, kind. She stood watching for a while before bringing them water. It felt strange, the simplicity of the act. Humans helping humans, no fear, no war, just need and care. Later that evening, Nachok came to her porch. He carried a bundle of corn and herbs. "Your food," he said, setting it down. "You will need it for winter." She smiled faintly. "You don't owe me this." "I owe the land," he said. "It has given too much blood." He turned to leave, but she stopped him with a quiet word. "Stay." He hesitated, then did. They sat in silence as the sky deepened from gold to indigo. The first stars appeared, reflected in the dark pools of his eyes. Lena listened to the steady rhythm of his breath, the quiet power in his stillness. "I used to think you were a monster," she said softly. "Now I don't know what you are." Nachok smiled, a faint, fleeting thing. "A man. That is enough." The warmth between them grew, subtle and steady, like a fire catching in damp wood. It didn't burn. It healed. She told him stories that night, not of sorrow, but of small things, of how Frank had taught her to ride, of the way her mother sang hymns when the rain fell, of how she used to dream of a child's laughter in the cabin that had known only silence. He listened, not interrupting, only nodding, his gaze soft, his expression unreadable. When the fire burned low, he stood. "You should rest." "Will you stay close?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked toward the creek. "Always." And she believed him. As he walked away, she watched the shadows swallow him, and yet, instead of fear, she felt peace. The kind that doesn't shout but whispers, the kind that grows in quiet hearts when forgiveness begins to take root. That night she dreamed of rain again, not the violent kind, but the gentle one, where every drop sounds like a promise. When she woke, her face was wet with tears, but her heart was calm. The past had been a wound too deep to speak of, but it was closing now, thread by thread, word by word, hand by hand. And though she did not yet say it, Lena Bishop knew she no longer saw Nachok as her captor. He had become her healer. And somewhere in the space between grief and grace, love began to bloom, quietly, stubbornly, like a wildflower breaking through desert stone. Autumn crept over the valley like a soft confession. The air grew cooler, the sky bluer, the light slower and tender, spilling gold across the dying fields. The harsh edge of summer faded into something gentler, a hush between storms. The leaves along the creek turned copper and ochre, whispering secrets to the wind. For the first time since Frank's death, Lena Bishop felt the weight inside her chest ease, not vanish, but loosen, like a knot finally learning how to breathe. She spent her mornings at the garden patch, her skirts brushing against the brittle stalks of corn as she harvested what little had survived. Some days, when she looked up, she would see Nachok's men fixing her barn roof, gathering firewood, or mending fences. They worked in silence, with a quiet grace that unsettled her at first, and then began to feel strangely comforting. They never asked permission, never demanded thanks. They simply did what needed to be done. When she walked by, they would nod, a gesture not of subservience, but of respect. She learned their names through fragments of conversation. Geronimo, old and clever, with a smile that glimmered like the edge of a blade. Cochise, young and fierce, who sometimes hummed as he worked. There was no more fear between them, only understanding born of survival. The boundaries that once divided hers and theirs had blurred into one shared rhythm, like the creek weaving through both camps without belonging to either. Nachok watched over it all, He didn't command loudly. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. When he spoke, the men listened. When he walked through camp, even the horses turned their heads. Lena had once thought his silence was arrogance. Now she saw it for what it was: discipline, patience, the kind of strength that didn't shout to be known. One afternoon she carried a pot of stew down to the creek. The smell of herbs and venison drifted through the air. The Apache men paused in their work, glancing toward her, but saying nothing. She set the pot near the fire and nodded once before turning to leave. Nachok's voice stopped her. "Stay." She turned, her heart beating in that soft, uncertain rhythm that had become familiar. He was sitting by the fire, the light glinting off the metal band tied around his arm. He gestured to the ground beside him. She hesitated for only a breath before sitting. They ate in silence at first. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the murmur of the creek nearby. The stew was hot, the flavor simple but full. She watched him eat with quiet curiosity. For all his strength, there was gentleness in his movements. He broke bread and handed her half, his fingers brushing hers just long enough to send a strange heat up her arm. "The sky will change soon," he said at last. "Snow will come before long." "I can feel it," she replied softly. "The air smells different." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We will stay through winter. The land needs tending. Your walls need repair." She studied him, the way the firelight softened his face, turning his hard features into something almost tender. "And after winter?" He looked at her then, his eyes dark and deep as the creek. "After winter comes life." Her heart fluttered like the wings of a trapped bird. She wanted to speak, to ask what kind of life he meant, but the words dissolved in her throat. Instead, she watched him as he reached for a piece of wood and began carving it with a knife, slow and deliberate strokes that shaped the grain into something delicate. When he finished, he held out a small figure, a hawk, wings spread. "For you," he said, "a protector." She took it in both hands. It was rough but beautiful, carved from cedar, smelling faintly of smoke. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do not thank me," he said quietly. "You saved me too." The words struck her like sunlight through storm clouds. "How?" she asked. He stared into the fire. "When you looked at me that day, I saved you from the snake. You did not see a monster anymore. You saw a man. No one has looked at me that way in a long time." Lena's breath caught. "You were never a monster." He turned to her then, and the look in his eyes was almost unbearable in its softness. "Once I believed I was. War teaches men to forget what they are." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke and wild mint. Somewhere an owl called, low and distant. The fire's glow wrapped them in a fragile circle of warmth, the rest of the world fading beyond it. Lena found herself smiling, small, unguarded, the first true smile she had worn in months. When she returned to her cabin later that night, she placed the carved hawk on the table beside her bed. It looked toward the window, as if keeping watch over her dreams. She slept deeply, peacefully, for the first time since Frank had died. In the days that followed, Nachok began spending more time near the homestead. He helped her repair the roof, showing her how to seal the gaps with mud and straw. His hands were large, calloused, but precise. When he lifted a beam, It was as if the wood itself obeyed him out of respect. She worked beside him, sweat beading along her temple, and felt the quiet companionship between them grow like something living. Sometimes he spoke of his people, of their beliefs, their songs, their dances under the moon. His words painted pictures of a world she had never imagined, rivers that spoke in dreams, mountains that held the memories of the dead, children who were taught to listen to the wind. And she told him about her childhood, about long summers in Missouri, about her father's laughter and her mother's hymns. He listened in silence, and she realized that no one had ever listened to her like that before, not even Frank. One evening, as they finished stacking wood, he asked quietly, "Do you still mourn him?" She hesitated. The truth was a tender bruise in her chest. "I mourn the man I thought he was." Natchok nodded slowly. "Then you are healing." The simplicity of the statement disarmed her. Healing. The word felt fragile on her tongue, but real. That night, the first frost came. The ground glittered silver under the pale moonlight, and the air carried a quiet electricity that made her heart ache. From her window, she saw the Apache campfire burning low by the creek, its reflection rippling across the water. And sitting beside it, wrapped in his blanket, was Natchok. He looked up at the same stars she did, and she felt, without knowing why, that he was thinking of her. The days grew shorter, and the rhythm of their shared life deepened. She began cooking for the whole camp, stews, cornbread, roasted squash. At first the men accepted it wordlessly, but soon they began leaving small gifts in return, bundles of herbs, polished stones, feathers tied with string. It became a quiet language of gratitude, one that needed no translation. One afternoon, while gathering herbs near the creek, Lena slipped on the damp stones and fell. She laughed, a sound so foreign it startled even her. Natchok, who had been nearby, came running. He crouched beside her, concern flashing across his face. "I'm fine," she said between laughter, brushing mud from her skirt. He smiled, the corner of his mouth curving. "You laugh like rain." The compliment stole her breath. It was simple, unadorned, and yet it filled her with warmth that spread through her veins like light. When he offered his hand to help her up, she took it. His fingers closed around hers, strong, steady, grounding. For a moment, time folded in on itself. The world went quiet except for the sound of the water, the pulse in her wrist, the shared breath between them. He didn't let go right away, and she didn't ask him to. That night she couldn't sleep. The memory of his hand lingered like an invisible flame. She sat by the window, the carved hawk beside her, watching the moon travel across the sky. She thought about how far she had come, from fear, from hatred, from grief, and how somewhere along the way she had begun to see him not as her captor, but as the reason she was still alive. Winter was coming, just as he had said, but for the first time she didn't dread it. The thought of snow falling across the valley filled her with a strange, tender hope. She wondered what it would be like to wake one morning and see the world remade in white, the sins of the past buried beneath a quiet, forgiving blanket. And though she couldn't name it yet, her heart already knew the answer. It would feel like healing, like the moment before love speaks its first word. In that quiet, she whispered to herself, not as a prayer, not as a vow, but as truth. I am not alone anymore. Outside, the creek murmured its eternal song. In the camp below, Nachok lifted his head, as if he had heard her. The distance between them was no longer measured in steps, but in heartbeats, and it was closing, slowly, beautifully, with every breath they took beneath the same endless sky. The first snow came quietly, like forgiveness descending from the sky. It fell in slow spirals, pale flakes glimmering in the fading light, softening the harsh lines of the valley. The dust that had once choked the land was gone, buried under a white silence that seemed to hush every wound. The world smelled clean again, like cedar, smoke, and the promise of peace. Lena Bishop stood on the porch, wrapped in a wool shawl, watching the snow gather on the rail. The chill kissed her cheeks, but inside her warmth bloomed, a warmth she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the fire inside the cabin or the layers of clothing. It was something quieter, deeper, something alive. Behind her, the cabin glowed golden with lamplight. The walls were patched now, the roof repaired, the floor swept clean. She had even hung a strip of dried flowers by the window, a small act of defiance against the years of grief that had stripped her world bare. Her home had begun to breathe again, just as she had. Down by the creek, smoke rose from the Apache camp. The men moved with purpose, preparing for the storm's deeper descent, stacking wood, tightening ropes, covering horses, and among them, as steady as the mountain itself, was Nachok. She had not seen him much over the last week. He had been busy with the preparations for winter, hunting farther into the mountains, but even when he wasn't near, his presence lingered. She could feel it in the silence that no longer frightened her, in the rhythm of her breath when she woke at dawn. As the snow thickened, she saw movement at the edge of the trees, a tall shadow breaking through the whiteness. He walked toward her cabin with long strides, the snow bending beneath his weight, but never slowing him. His hair was dusted white, his shoulders wrapped in a heavy fur cloak, and he carried something in his hands. When he reached the porch, he paused, his breath rising in slow, calm clouds. "For you," he said, holding out a bundle wrapped in hide. She took it carefully. Inside were 2 rabbits, cleaned and tied neatly together. "You didn't have to," she said softly. "I hunt," he replied. "You cook. It is balance." A smile touched her lips. "Then come inside. It's cold enough to turn the air to glass." He hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them both. She hung the rabbits by the door, stoked the fire, and poured hot coffee into 2 mugs. He sat by the hearth, silent, watching the flames with that same focused stillness that she had come to recognize as thought, not distance. She studied him in the firelight. His face was marked by the journey, lines of exhaustion, a faint cut at his temple, but his eyes were softer tonight, as if the snow had gentled even him. "Your people," she said quietly. "They're not afraid of the winter?" He looked at her. "We do not fear what we understand. Winter is a teacher. It takes what is weak, but it gives strength to what endures." Lena nodded slowly. "Then maybe that's why I'm still here." A faint curve touched his mouth, not quite a smile, but close. "You are stronger than you think." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that was not empty but full, heavy with unspoken things. The fire crackled softly. The wind outside sighed against the walls, carrying with it the sound of snow brushing against the earth. When she finally spoke again, her voice was gentle. "You said your brother's spirit wanders until the blood debt is settled." "Yes," he said. "And now, do you think he's at peace?" Nachok's gaze lingered on the flames. "He is quieter. I feel him less in the wind, less in my dreams. Perhaps that is peace." She looked at him, the weight of his sorrow filling the space between them. "You've carried so much. So have you." He turned to her then, and their eyes met in the dim light. The fire flickered between them, painting gold across his skin. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she reached out, slow and uncertain, and touched his hand. His fingers curled around hers instinctively, warm and solid. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a bridge built between two broken worlds. They stayed like that for a long time, two hands joined above a fire that had once divided them. Later, she made stew from the rabbits he had brought. They ate together in quiet contentment. When he rose to leave, she stopped him with a single word. "Stay." He looked at her, uncertain. "For tonight," she said, her voice low. "The snow's thickening. You can't make it back to camp." He hesitated only a moment before nodding. She made up a bed for him near the hearth, laying down an extra quilt. As she moved about the small cabin, he watched her, the firelight catching the faint shimmer of her hair. She felt his eyes on her, and instead of fear, it filled her with warmth. When she finally sat again, the silence returned, not the heavy kind of their first encounters, but something tender, something that wrapped around them like a shared heartbeat. He spoke quietly. "You are not the same woman I found that day on the porch." She looked into the fire. "And you are not the same man who made that vow." His gaze softened. "Maybe both of us died that day. What remains is what was meant to live." Her eyes met his, and the air between them grew thick with something too powerful to name. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. His presence filled the small space, the scent of him, smoke, pine and earth, mixing with the warmth of the fire. When he finally reached across the distance and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, her breath caught. His touch was careful, reverent, as though afraid she might shatter. But she didn't. She leaned into it. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no snow, no grief, no ghosts, only the slow rhythm of two souls learning to recognize each other. He withdrew his hand then, the movement reluctant. "Sleep," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be colder." She nodded, though her heart refused to quiet. When she lay down in her bed, the fire still glowed softly across the room, and she could see his silhouette by the flames, broad, still, protective. Sometime in the night, she woke to silence. The wind had died, and snowflakes drifted lazily past the window. Nachok was no longer by the hearth. For a moment, panic flared in her chest. Then she saw him, standing outside, bare-headed in the snow, his face turned to the sky. She rose quietly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped out to join him. The air bit at her skin, but it was clean, alive. "What are you doing?" she whispered. He didn't turn. "Listening." "To what?" "The silence," he said. "It speaks when you are still enough." She stood beside him, letting the stillness sink into her bones. The snow fell thicker now, the flakes landing softly on their hair, their clothes, their joined breath. "I used to hate silence," she said. "After Frank died, it felt like punishment. Now, it feels like rest." He turned to her then, his eyes deep and calm. "That is what healing sounds like." Her chest ached with something too big for words. The moonlight caught on the snow between them, and in that glow he looked both fierce and gentle, like the land itself, ancient, unyielding, and yet capable of infinite tenderness. Without thinking, she stepped closer. The distance between them vanished, and for the first time she didn't feel like she was falling. She felt like she was coming home. He raised a hand, cupped her face. His touch was warm against the chill, grounding and sure. "Lena," he murmured, her name breaking from him like a prayer. She closed her eyes as he leaned in, and their lips met, softly, reverently, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. It wasn't the kiss of conquest or claim, but one of surrender, of understanding, of two lives stitched together by pain and reborn through grace. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart beneath the layers of fur and skin. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that this wild, impossible peace was real. The night held them like a secret. When morning came, the valley was buried in white. The world had been remade. She woke to find him tending the fire, his movements careful not to wake her. When he noticed she was awake, he smiled, a small, quiet smile that reached his eyes. Outside, the snow glittered in the sunlight, and for the first time in years, Lena felt no fear of what came next. The past was gone, buried deep beneath the frozen earth. What remained was this moment, the warmth, the quiet, the slow unfurling of love, born not from desire, but from the simple, miraculous act of healing. And though neither said it aloud, both knew the truth that had always lived beneath the silence. The vow that began in anger had transformed into something sacred, something that would carry them through the winter and beyond. The storm had passed. What remained was life. The snow did not stop for 3 days. It fell in slow, endless veils that swallowed sound and time, wrapping the valley in a white silence so pure it felt almost holy. The world had become a cathedral of stillness. The mountains bowed under the weight of it, the creek whispered softly beneath its frozen skin, and the cabin glowed like a small, warm heart beating in the middle of eternity. Inside, Lena and Nachok moved together in a quiet rhythm that needed no words. He mended the tools near the fire, the muscles of his arms gleaming bronze against the golden light, while she stirred a pot of stew that filled the cabin with the scent of rosemary and meat. There was peace in their closeness, not the fragile kind born from fear or apology, but the steady, rooted kind that grows when two people stop fighting the past and begin to live inside the present. Sometimes they spoke, softly, their voices blending with the crackle of the fire. Other times they simply listened, to the sigh of the wind, to the faint settling of snow on the roof, to the rhythm of each other's breath. The land beyond their door had become a wilderness of white, but inside the cabin there was warmth, laughter, and something gentler still, a healing that came not as a miracle, but as a choice made every single day. One morning, she woke to find him standing by the window. The dawn was pale and new, and the first light of it painted him in shades of gold and shadow. He looked like part of the land itself, strong, quiet, endless. "The snow has stopped," he said without turning. She rose, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and came to stand beside him. The valley was unrecognizable, the scars of battle, the graves, the burned patches of earth, all of it was hidden beneath a smooth white peace. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It is the earth beginning again," he said. "She buries what must be forgotten and gives rest to what was hurt." She looked up at him, her eyes soft. "And what about us?" He turned then, his gaze deep and steady. "We are part of that same earth." His words sank into her like sunlight through cold water, spreading warmth through every aching part of her. She reached for his hand and found it waiting for her, strong and sure. They spent the day tending small things, splitting wood, fetching water, cooking, feeding the horses. Simple tasks, but each one felt sacred in its own way. When dusk came, the world outside glowed blue and silver beneath the rising moon. Nachok built a fire in the yard, its light reflecting off the snow like scattered stars. "Tonight," he said, "we give thanks." Lena followed him outside, her breath clouding in the cold. He stood tall in the firelight, his eyes reflecting the flames, and for the first time she saw him not as a warrior, but as something larger, a man bound not just by blood, but by reverence for life itself. He lifted his hands to the sky and began to speak in his native tongue. The words rose like smoke, low, rhythmic, ancient. Lena didn't understand the language, but she understood the meaning. Gratitude, forgiveness, remembrance. The sound of it moved through her like the slow healing beat of a drum. When he finished, he looked at her and gestured to the fire. "Now you," he said softly. "Speak to whatever listens in your heart." She hesitated, then closed her eyes. The cold bit at her cheeks, the fire warmed her palms. She thought of Frank, his laughter, his lies, his restless ghost, and she thought of the land that had both broken and remade her. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible over the wind, "for letting me live, for giving me the chance to love again, for teaching me that even the hardest hearts can be softened by kindness." When she opened her eyes, Nachok was watching her. He said nothing. He only stepped closer, took her hands in his, and pressed them against his chest. Beneath his palm, she felt the steady, unyielding beat of his heart. "This," he said, "is how peace begins." They stood that way for a long time, the fire crackling between them, the stars shining cold and bright above. Later that night, when the flames had burned low, they returned to the cabin. The air was warm, heavy with the smell of cedar and smoke. Nachok sat by the hearth, his eyes half closed, the fire painting gold across his skin. Lena knelt beside him and began to unwrap the bandage on his shoulder, where the bullet wound from the battle had healed into a pale scar. She touched it gently, her fingers tracing the mark. "It doesn't hurt any more?" she asked. "No," he said. "Some scars do not hurt. They remember." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe that's what I am, a scar that remembers." He reached out, cupping her face in his hand. "No," he said softly. "You are the part that healed." Something inside her broke and mended in the same breath. She leaned forward and kissed him, slow, tender, full of the quiet understanding that neither of them needed words to explain. His hand found her waist, hers the side of his face. The world outside fell away until there was only the warmth of skin, the rhythm of breath, and the steady, grounding truth that they had found each other at the end of all things. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from the strange, exquisite relief of being whole again. Outside, the wind shifted. The snow began to fall once more, softer now, like a benediction. Days turned to weeks, and the rhythm of winter became the rhythm of their life. They cooked, worked, laughed. Sometimes, when the evenings were long, Nachok would tell her stories, legends of his people, of how the stars were once campfires of ancient spirits, of how the earth sings softly when it's ready to bloom again. And she would listen, her heart unfolding like a flower in the warmth of his voice. There were nights she woke to the sound of his breathing beside her, deep and even, and she would lie there, watching the firelight dance across his features. The man who had once come as her destroyer now lay beside her as her salvation. He had taken nothing from her. Instead, he had given her back everything she had lost: faith, tenderness, the courage to dream again. One evening, as spring hinted faintly at the edge of the horizon, she felt a flutter deep inside her, a fragile, trembling life beginning to stir. She pressed a hand to her belly, her eyes filling with tears that glowed in the firelight. When Nachok saw her, he understood without words. He crossed the room and knelt before her, his large hand covering hers. His eyes, usually dark and steady, shone with something unguarded, almost holy. "A child," he whispered, "our child." Her heart swelled until it hurt. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking. "Our son." He closed his eyes, his forehead resting against her knees. For a long time they stayed that way, two souls who had carried grief like armor, now holding the first fragile promise of life between them. By the time the snow melted, the land was transformed. The creek sang again, wildflowers pushed through the thawing soil, and the air smelled of new beginnings. The cabin stood proud and warm, a testament to everything they had survived. Lena often sat on the porch at dusk, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of rose and gold. Sometimes Nachok joined her, sitting in silence as the stars began to rise. And in those quiet moments she felt the presence of all that had been lost, the ghosts, the pain, the old life, and she thanked them too for leading her here, because healing, she had learned, wasn't about forgetting, it was about remembering differently, without hate, without fear, without the need to run. When the first true warmth of spring came, the valley bloomed. The trees along the creek filled with green, and the air buzzed with life. She walked barefoot through the grass, one hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her belly, and felt the wind move around her like a blessing. The land had been scarred by blood and sorrow, but now it pulsed with life again. So did she. That night, as the stars shimmered above their little home, Nachok stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, their breath moving together in perfect rhythm. "This land remembers everything," he whispered against her hair. "But it remembers love the longest." She leaned back against him, eyes closing, a smile touching her lips. "Then let it remember us." He kissed her temple. "It will." And so the vow made in grief became the promise of life. The winter that had begun with pain ended with renewal. And somewhere in that quiet valley, under the watch of endless stars, two broken hearts learned what it truly meant to be whole again. If this story touched something tender in you, if it reminded you that love can grow even in the harshest seasons, that hearts can heal even after they've been shattered, then let the light it carried stay with you for a while. And if you felt warmth in these words, please leave a small sign behind, a like, a comment, a moment to share your thoughts. Your voice is the breath that keeps stories alive, and your presence here means more than you know. Subscribe if you'd walk with me again into another tale of love, loss, and rebirth. And until that time, may peace find you, may healing stay with you, and may your heart always remember that even in the coldest winter, love is waiting to bloom.